The sound of the glass shattering was nothing compared to the sound of my heart breaking. It was Thierry who found us, not in the act, but in the aftermath. He didn't scream. He didn't even cry. He just stood there, holding the pearl necklace he was going to give me for our anniversary. That look on his face, that cold, absolute stillness, was worse than any rage. In that second, I understood what I had done. I had traded a lifetime of stability for a few stolen hours of fire. And now, everything was gone. The only question left was how deep the fall would be.
I had always considered myself a woman anchored by clear, stable lines, a person who knew the difference between a ripple and a tidal wave. My life in Marindale, a city where the endless ocean met the quiet reality of small-town life, was meant to be predictable, secure, and, above all, honorable. I shared 15 years with my husband, Thierry. He was a good man, steady and utterly devoted to his work, providing a fortress of security that I had once mistaken for happiness. Now it felt more like a very comfortable cage, and I found myself craving the unfamiliar vastness of the sea just beyond our window. My marriage to Thierry hadn't died in a single dramatic explosion. It had simply faded away in a slow, suffocating fog of routine and unspoken compromises. We still shared the same elegant house, the same bed, and the same last name. But we were like two perfectly composed statues in a museum. We moved through our days with polite conversation about logistics and schedules, never truly touching the vulnerable core of what we had built. The fire was long gone, replaced by a chilly respect, a far more painful substitute for love than outright hate could ever be. I often caught myself staring at him across the dinner table, a feeling of utter loneliness washing over me. The emptiness became a hollow echo inside our perfectly curated home, an invisible space where passion and spontaneity used to reside. It was an absence so profound that I began to feel like I was fading into the furniture, becoming a ghost in my own life story. I kept telling myself that this was simply what long-term commitment looked like, that the spark was a juvenile fantasy, and that real love was built on mutual obligation. This constant internal negotiation was my defense mechanism, a shield against the creeping sense that I had made the wrong choice somewhere along the line. I knew I needed something to remind me that I was a woman, not just a wife. Then the door to my carefully constructed world creaked open, and a devastating draft rushed in, utterly unprepared to meet the man who was about to disrupt my entire moral foundation. He wasn't subtle or quiet. He was a storm dressed in tailored clothing, brought in as a consultant on the high-profile architectural project I was managing. His name was Dorian. The moment he walked into the boardroom, 10 years my younger and vibrating with a primal energy I'd forgotten existed, the air itself seemed to crackle around him. He didn't look at me like a colleague. He looked at me like a secret waiting to be unleashed. His presence was instantly an intoxicating danger, a violation of the silent rules I had enforced upon myself for years. Dorian possessed a careless, almost reckless charm, the kind that made my professional facade instantly unstable. He would hold my gaze just a second too long, and his laugh, a deep, resonant sound, would ripple through the sterile office space and settle in the hollow of my chest. Everything about him screamed forbidden, and I told myself I was only admiring his talent, his youth, his sheer vitality. I wasn't admiring the way his presence made my skin feel alive again. The truth was, Dorian saw the woman Thierry no longer seemed to notice. He saw the fire trapped beneath the ice, and he wasn't afraid to let it melt. Every interaction was a slow, deliberate tightening of a wire around my resolve. I tried to maintain a distance, using professional courtesy as a flimsy shield, but his eyes were relentless, promising a reminder of the passion I'd buried. I knew this path was catastrophic, yet I found myself waiting, breath held for his next calculated move, because the worst part was, I wanted him to shatter my perfect life. I tried, desperately, to draw a thick, dark line between my professional obligations and the personal chaos Dorian ignited within me. We spent countless hours together in the pressurized quiet of the office, reviewing blueprints and calculating margins. But the real work was the elaborate effort I put into controlling my own breath. Every time he leaned across the table, his powerful forearm brushing mine as he pointed out a structural flaw, my resolve fractured just a little more. I'd quickly pull back, focusing fiercely on the work, only to find his eyes already watching me, a look of amusement and knowing patience glittering in the depths of their A's. He knew exactly the effect he was having. Dorian's technique wasn't about aggressive pursuit. It was about subtle infiltration, targeting the empty spaces Thierry had left behind. He never spoke ill of my husband, never pushed boundaries in public, which made his seduction all the more insidious. He'd talk about art, about philosophy, about the sheer thrill of building something new. Things Thierry had long dismissed as irrelevant distractions from the important work of earning money. Dorian made me feel seen and intellectually stimulated, remembering parts of myself that I thought the marriage had buried under 15 years of practicality. He wasn't just flirting, he was speaking a forgotten language to my soul. The first moment the line truly blurred was during a late-night site inspection at a desolate waterfront property. The night air was crisp, carrying a strong, salty scent of the bay, and the darkness felt vast and secretive. Dorian spoke about his childhood dreams, revealing a vulnerability that stripped away his confident armor. It was an intimacy I hadn't shared with Thierry in years. As we stood there, shoulders almost touching, he reached out, not to touch me, but to gently brush a loose strand of hair from my face. That single, fleeting contact gelled the blood in my veins. His voice, low and sincere in the dark, held a dangerous kind of reverence. "You look at me, Vivian, but you see the consequences. And I see the woman you've hidden from the world, the one who deserves to be truly alive." I could feel the heat radiating off him, the potent combination of youth and forbidden desire. Every rational thought I possessed was screaming at me to step back, to remember the vows I made, the life I'd chosen. But my feet remained planted on the cold concrete, held captive by the simple, aching truth that I was being pursued. I was wanted. The tension, now thick and almost unbearable, began to translate into tangible actions. A quick shared glance across a crowded restaurant, a moment in the elevator where our hands accidentally, or not so accidentally, touched. I started wearing clothes I knew he would notice, choosing scents meant to linger, suddenly caring about details Thierry hadn't complimented in a decade. I was no longer a dutiful wife. I was a woman preparing for battle against myself. I was playing with fire, telling myself I could control the flames, even though I knew the slightest gust could turn it into an inferno. I was falling into a pattern of self-sabotage, an addiction to the adrenaline of the forbidden. I started making excuses to stay late, creating fictitious dilemmas just to spend another 15 minutes talking to Dorian. Every time I drove home, the headlights cutting through the Marindale darkness, the guilt was a heavy passenger riding beside me. Yet the memory of his touch, the promise in his eyes, always managed to silence the voice of my conscience, forcing me to ask myself, how much longer could I pretend that this was just business?
I finally broke down and looked him up, Not just the professional LinkedIn profile that listed his impressive credentials and consulting history, but a deep dive into the internet's quiet corners. I was desperate to find some kind of flaw, a concrete reason to dismiss him, a bad habit, a shady past, anything that would restore my moral footing. What I found was almost worse than any scandal. There was practically nothing. Dorian was a ghost in the digital world, leaving only a perfect, polished professional trace that seemed too clean, too controlled for a man so bursting with unbridled energy. The only personal detail I could uncover was that he wasn't from Marindale. He was a transplant from a major, unnamed East Coast city. The absence of a personal history felt like a deliberate strategy, a carefully constructed void that allowed him to be whatever I needed him to be in the moment. He was a canvas onto which I could project all the unmet desires of my own life. This air of mystery only intensified my obsession. I started asking him subtle, seemingly innocuous questions about his family and his past. Watching how easily he deflected them with charming half-answers that dissolved into philosophical discussions. He was a master of intimacy without substance, always giving me just enough to keep me invested, but never enough to truly know the man behind the eyes. One afternoon, Thierry called me into his library, a room usually reserved for heavy financial conversations. He didn't look upset, just serious. He told me he was considering a major investment with a powerful old money family from his childhood circle, the Blackwoods. Their reputation was immaculate, their reach vast, and Thierry was anxious to finalize the deal, seeing it as his legacy. As he talked about the contracts, I felt a sudden, sharp coldness in my stomach. The way he stressed the word Blackwood felt like a warning, though I couldn't articulate why the name felt so heavy and foreboding in that moment. Thierry casually mentioned that the Blackwood family had an extensive portfolio, including some smaller properties that our own firm had been indirectly overseeing. Then he dropped the detail that made my professional mask almost crack. They sent a junior consultant to monitor the Marindale project for them, someone young. Can't remember his name, but you're working on that site, Vivian. Maybe you know him. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I swallowed hard, managing a neutral. Possibly. We have several consultants rotating through, never mentioning Dorian. The thought that Dorian might not be our consultant but Thierry's family spy made everything feel terrifyingly interconnected. This revelation completely changed the dynamics of our interaction. Dorian was no longer just the handsome younger colleague. He was a potential undercover agent tied to the very foundation of Thierry's wealth and future. Was he using the professional entanglement to get closer to Thierry's business secrets? Or was the forbidden romance a dangerous side effect of his primary mission? The distinction didn't matter because the stakes had just been raised from a domestic affair to a massive professional and financial catastrophe. If Thierry ever found out the truth, he wouldn't just be hurt, he would be ruined. The terror of exposure was now inextricably linked to the thrill of the chase. I looked at Dorian with fresh eyes. Did the passion in his gaze hide a calculated agenda? The fire he offered suddenly felt less like salvation and more like a Trojan horse. I was trapped between my growing emotional dependence on him and the absolute terror of the colossal secret I was now holding. I knew I had to find out why he was really here, but how could I uncover his truth without revealing my own fatal weakness? The air between Dorian and I changed immediately. I couldn't look at him without seeing the phantom shadow of the Blackwood family, Thierry's legacy, and my own disastrous folly interwoven with every glance. I scheduled a private meeting under the guise of reviewing a crucial financial projection, but my real intention was to execute a dangerous, high-stakes interrogation. I sat across from him in the empty conference room. The large wooden table suddenly felt like a fortress separating two enemies. I had to know if he was a predator sent to destroy my husband, or simply a man whose fatal attraction was an unintended, beautiful accident. I started by casually mentioning the Blackwood deal, watching his face with the intensity of a scientist examining a volatile chemical reaction. I noted the momentary hesitation in his eyes, a flicker of surprise quickly masked by his usual effortless charm. "Ah, the Blackwoods," he said smoothly, leaning back in his chair with a relaxed smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "A massive operation. Thierry seems quite invested in that legacy." His tone was too casual, the mention of Thierry too familiar, immediately solidifying my worst fears. He was definitely aware of the connection. I pushed further, my voice low and steady, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. "They have a lot of irons in the fire, I hear. I believe they even have someone monitoring our specific project. A younger consultant, perhaps." The moment those words left my mouth, the room went silent. Dorian's smile finally vanished, replaced with a guarded expression of intense calculation. He held my gaze, his eyes dark and piercing, and for the first time I genuinely felt a chill of danger that wasn't purely romantic. He was no longer just a lover. He was an operator. After a tense pause that stretched on forever, he offered a carefully curated response. "My role is complex, Vivian. I'm here for a specific reason, yes, but I'm always loyal to the work at hand." He deliberately avoided confirming his ties to the Blackwoods, instead redirecting the focus back to our shared professional space. I realized he was testing me, gauging how much I knew and whether my newfound knowledge would make me retreat. His refusal to fully deny or confirm the financial espionage was a confirmation in itself. He was keeping a massive, destructive secret. The line he drew was clear. The attraction was one thing, but his true purpose was another. And I shouldn't mistake the fire we shared for total honesty. The thought that every shared moment, every intense look, might have been a calculated move to get closer to Thierry's business sent a sickening wave of betrayal through me. I felt cheap, used, and utterly reckless. Yet as I stood to leave, the fear mingled with a perverse curiosity. Did he still want me, or was I just a convenient way to get closer to the empire he intended to collapse? Dorian's final words, whispered as I reached the door, were a devastating, classic cliffhanger, designed to keep me entangled. "Whatever my reasons for being here, Vivian, they don't change what I feel when I look at you. And believe me, my feelings for you are the most dangerous part of my assignment." Dorian's cryptic admission that his feelings for me were the real danger didn't offer comfort. It offered a terrifying new dilemma. Was he telling the truth? Or was it the most sophisticated lie of all, designed to keep me emotionally invested while he quietly dismantled my husband's empire? I became obsessed with finding proof, needing to know whether I was truly betraying Thierry for love or merely for a calculated tool of corporate espionage. I couldn't bear the thought that I was simply a means to an end, a flimsy pawn in a game far larger and colder than passion. I realized the only way to unearth Dorian's true agenda was to play his game. If he was dealing in secrets, I would trade secrets. I began deliberately leaving sensitive documents related to the Marindel project on my desk, ensuring they were visible during our late-night work sessions. This wasn't just about baiting him. It was an agonizing test of his sincerity. Every time he glanced down at the papers, I held my breath, watching for the subtle twitch that would confirm his professional ruthlessness. The knowledge that I was compromising Thierry's security for a man I barely knew was a gut-wrenching, agonizing act of betrayal. The pressure began to weigh heavily on my behavior at home, creating noticeable fractures in the facade I maintained with Thierry. I became irritable, distracted, and jumpy whenever my phone buzzed. Thierry, ever the rationalist, noticed the shift, but attributed it to work stress. "You're burning yourself out, Vivian," he commented one night, his voice devoid of real concern, simply stating a logical observation. His lack of emotional curiosity was both a shield, protecting my secret, and a sharp reminder of the profound disconnect that had driven me into Dorian's arms in the first place. I finally caught him. We were wrapping up late, the office completely silent, when I accidentally dropped a folder labeled Thierry's Private Financials, Blackwood Holdings. As I bent down, I saw it. Dorian's eyes flickered down to the exposed documents, and the professional calm vanished. For one brief, unguarded second, his gaze was pure, unadulterated hunger, not for me, but for the information I'd left exposed. That single second was enough. I had my answer. The romance, the intensity, it was all tied to his mission, a beautiful and lethal distraction. The realization should have made me recoil, should have galvanized me to walk away immediately. Instead, a strange sense of resignation and fatalism settled over me. He was using me, but I was also using him, using his fire as an escape from the cold reality of my marriage. We were two broken people using a destructive passion to fill our respective voids. I had traded the quiet safety of my life for a thrilling, catastrophic gamble, and I found I couldn't bear to lose the rush. I decided I would let the game continue, but on my own terms. As I gathered my things, the office lights reflecting the cold truth of my compromise, I knew I had crossed a threshold. I was no longer a victim of circumstance, but an active participant in my own destruction and Thierry's downfall. I would stay close to Dorian, not only for the illicit fire, but also to monitor the damage, to understand the plan. The real question was, how long could I keep playing this dangerous double game before one of my husbands, the past or the future, found me out? The cold calculation of Dorian's true intent, his financial objective, should have acted as a powerful repellent, a brutal reminder of my integrity. Instead, it became the final permission I needed to surrender. If the whole affair was destined to be a disaster, then I might as well embrace the magnificent ruin it promised. The constant, agonizing tension had to break, and I was tired of standing on the edge. I called him that evening, my voice dangerously steady, and simply said, "We need to discuss the new acquisition proposal. It can't wait." We both understood that the acquisition being discussed was my own surrender. He didn't choose the office. He chose a secluded loft downtown, a space as anonymous and modern as his own carefully constructed public image. I stood outside the steel door for a minute that felt like an hour, the pulsing throb of anticipation battling the icy spike of guilt. I remembered Thierry, sleeping soundly in our huge bed, oblivious to the catastrophe unfolding just miles away. My roots, my history, the stability Thierry offered, it all felt like a weight, a heavy coat I was desperate to shed, even if it meant stepping naked into the unforgiving night. The moment Dorian opened the door, I stepped inside, closing the door on my past life. The air inside the loft was heavy, charged not just with heat, but with a palpable sense of doom, the shared knowledge that we were finally doing the one thing that could never be undone. There were no false promises, no sweet words, just the recognition of two people finally giving in to a force they had unsuccessfully fought for months. He didn't rush. He reached out slowly, his fingers tracing the hollow of my throat, and his eyes searched mine, asking one last time if this was truly what I wanted. I met his gaze and nodded, a silent, fatal confession. When his lips finally met mine, it was an explosion, not a gentle kiss. It was the release of every suppressed thought, every stolen glance, every frustrated whisper that had been trapped between us. This was not the reverent, healing kiss of the storm. This was hunger, recklessness, and a terrifying, exquisite desperation. I clung to him, allowing myself to drown in the sensation, finally feeling real and tangible after years of floating ghost-like through my marriage. The scent of him, clean, sharp, and utterly dominant, was the only reality I acknowledged. Afterward, lying there,
in the suffocating quiet, the clarity hit me with the force of a physical blow. The act of total betrayal had not brought relief. It had brought a searing, profound shame. My body had found its escape, but my mind was utterly fractured. I thought I could separate the pleasure from the guilt, but they were inextricably linked, twisting together into a rope that was quickly tightening around my neck. I was terrified of being caught, but more terrified of the person I had just allowed myself to become. I left before dawn, sneaking out of the loft and driving back to Marindale under the shroud of a fragile gray morning. I knew that I hadn't just committed a single act of infidelity, I had fundamentally altered the trajectory of 3 lives. I was now bound to Dorian by a secret far deeper than any financial plot, a secret that could destroy Thierry and everything we had built. I had embraced the fire, and now the ashes were settling, revealing a truth I couldn't ignore. The worst part about running away is realizing you're running toward a cliff.
Returning to the office after that night was agonizing, every floorboard seeming to creak a confession of my guilt. I was now caught in a relentless vice grip, the ecstatic memory of Dorian's touch on one side and the crushing reality of Thierry's vulnerability on the other. I avoided Dorian for 2 days, using remote meetings and technical excuses, needing space to reset my fractured moral compass. But the silence didn't bring clarity. It brought only a terrifying echo of the irrevocable mistake I had made. The fire was extinguished, leaving behind only the cold smoke of fear. The facade of my marriage, once sturdy, now felt like a cheap set that could collapse with a strong breeze. Thierry seemed exactly the same, focused, meticulous, and emotionally distant, but I was hyper-aware of his every movement. I watched him across the dinner table, studying the familiar lines around his mouth, realizing I loved the history we shared, even if I no longer loved the man. The irony was brutal. By running toward passion, I had only highlighted the depth of the roots I was tearing up. I knew I had to choose: save the marriage or embrace the disaster. My attempt to choose the former was spurred by a terrifying discovery. While discreetly looking through Thierry's briefcase, an act of paranoia I would never have conceived of a month ago, I found a printed sheet of unusual data. It wasn't standard business paperwork. It was a detailed background check on a prominent competitor who had recently been sniffing around the Marindale project. The sheer coldness of Thierry's preparation chilled me. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a player who anticipated and neutralized threats long before they reached his perimeter. A name jumped out at me from the report. A name attached to a shadow company listed as a potential buyer of our property. Blackwood Holdings. The puzzle pieces slammed together violently. Dorian wasn't just consulting for them. The Blackwoods were actively trying to acquire Thierry's land, likely through a hostile takeover concealed by layers of shell companies. Thierry wasn't oblivious. He was investigating. My affair with Dorian wasn't just emotional treason. It was providing the enemy with direct, intimate access to the heart of the operation. The gravity of the situation hit me. Thierry was fighting a war I had unwittingly helped the enemy win. I realized my husband might be ruthless in business, but he was currently the unaware victim of my ultimate betrayal. My guilt intensified, evolving from a personal failing into a vast, complex scheme of corporate espionage. I felt a sudden, urgent need to protect him, not out of love, but out of sheer terror of the consequences if his empire and my comfortable life came tumbling down. The passion with Dorian suddenly seemed cheap and ugly compared to the scale of the impending ruin. I knew I needed to meet Dorian again, but this time the purpose would be entirely different. I wouldn't seek pleasure. I would seek the truth about the Blackwoods' plan and try to find a way to mitigate the damage I'd helped inflict. I had to know what Thierry was up against.
But as I sent the text message requesting an urgent meeting, a new sickening thought dawned. If Thierry was already running background checks on his rivals, how long would it be before he ran one on the new, younger consultant who suddenly shared so much of my time? The game wasn't just about money anymore, it was about survival. I arranged the meeting with Dorian not in the privacy of his loft, but in the neutral, guarded setting of a quiet, upscale bar far from Marindale. I needed to control the environment. I needed to look him in the eye and pierce the veneer of his professional charm. When he arrived, his expression was a carefully practiced blend of concern and desire, and he immediately tried to bridge the gap I'd created between us. He reached for my hand, but I pulled it back swiftly, the memory of Thierry's background checks burning in my mind. I was here for answers, not for another dangerous distraction. I cut straight to the chase, my voice low but sharp with accusation. The Blackwoods, Dorian. Don't deny it. I know they're behind the acquisition attempts, and I know you're not just a consultant. You're their advance man. The casual confidence he usually wore fractured slightly. He didn't look surprised that I knew the Blackwood name, but he was clearly taken aback by the speed and certainty of my discovery. The moment of silence that followed was heavy, filled with the undeniable truth that our affair had been built on a foundation of professional deceit. His romantic declarations suddenly seemed cheap and ugly. He sighed, leaning back, and finally conceding the point with a weary resignation that looked strangely genuine. Yes, I'm monitoring the Marindale project for them. They're keen on acquiring the assets. Thierry's company is vulnerable right now. He admitted the facts, but offered no apology for the manipulation. Instead, he smoothly pivoted, trying to frame his actions. But I never asked you for information, Vivian. I never used our time together for my job. The lines blurred because I let them, not because I intended to ruin your husband. This thing between us is real, regardless of my assignment. I stared at him, trying to separate the manipulative operative from the man who made me feel alive. Then tell me the full truth, Dorian. Why the Blackwoods? What is their interest in Thierry specifically? This isn't just about business, is it? I pressed, sensing a deeper narrative. His demeanor shifted again, his eyes darkening, and he finally dropped the corporate mask entirely. What emerged was a man fueled by something far more potent than money, a slow, seething rage that had been carefully concealed. He lowered his voice, the confession raw and startling. This isn't just a hostile takeover, Vivian. It's about revenge. Thierry ruined someone very close to me years ago, financially and reputationally, when he was just starting out. Thierry built his empire on the ashes of another man's life. He looked directly into my eyes, and the chilling part was that I saw a flicker of the very same distant, cold ruthlessness I knew my husband possessed. Dorian wasn't a spy, he was an avenging angel. The realization was a punch to the gut. I hadn't just committed adultery. I had slept with the man sworn to avenge a past sin committed by my husband. This wasn't a random affair. It was a cosmic setup for a Greek tragedy. The romantic fire felt like a horrifying predestined trap. As I absorbed the magnitude of this revelation, Dorian delivered the final blow that shattered my remaining composure. Thierry may be your victim now, Vivian, but he didn't just ruin a partner, he ruined my father.
Dorian's final sentence hung in the air, transforming the upscale bar into a stage for absolute tragedy. The man I had betrayed my husband for was not a random spark of passion, but the agent of a historical, inescapable revenge. I hadn't chosen fire. I had chosen a predestined collision orchestrated by sins committed years before I even met Dorian. The cold realization that my desperate search for happiness had been co-opted into a family vendetta was sickening. I looked at Dorian, seeing not a lover but a weapon, honed and aimed at the heart of Thierry's life,
a weapon I had willfully given access to. I needed to know the details, the human cost behind Thierry's ruthless climb. Dorian, now unburdened by the deepest secret, spoke with a chilling clarity. He detailed how Thierry, in a brutal early business maneuver, had orchestrated a massive financial collapse that ruined his father, a man named Silas. Silas lost his company, his reputation, and ultimately his will to live. Dorian's voice was devoid of self-pity, replaced by a quiet, absolute determination. He wasn't looking for money, he was seeking a pound of flesh, and the Marindale Project was the perfect, highly visible vehicle for that destruction. The new knowledge created a terrifying shift in my perspective on Thierry. I knew he was cold and ambitious, but I had never thought him truly cruel. Now, his silence, his focus, his entire fortress of security felt tainted by that long-ago act of calculated devastation. Was my husband's wealth built on a crime? The thought made the beautiful antiques in our house, the security of my life, feel like ill-gotten gains. I suddenly felt less guilty about my affair and more complicit in a historical injustice. This subtle moral shift made it easier to justify my continued closeness to Dorian. I confronted Dorian with the inevitable moral question. Do you truly intend to ruin Thierry? To leave him with nothing? He met my gaze without flinching. I intend to make him pay the debt of the father. He must lose what he values most. His response was clinical, but then his eyes softened, focusing entirely on me. And you, Vivian, are the unexpected complication. The part of the plan I can't control. I didn't come here looking for you, but I won't let you be destroyed when the walls come down. He was offering me a lifeline, an impossible choice between the past and the future. I made a dangerous, calculated decision. I needed to stay intertwined with Dorian, not to protect Thierry, but to protect myself and to learn every detail of the Blackwood plan, the better to soften my own landing when the inevitable crash came. I told Dorian I would help him understand Thierry's vulnerabilities, but only on the condition that he give me a full, verifiable account of his father's downfall. We were now officially conspirators, bound by a destructive passion and a mutual need for revenge and survival. I drove home that night with the chilling new reality weighing on me. I was no longer an adulteress. I was a double agent caught in a war between two powerful, vengeful men. As I slipped into the house, I noticed a detail I had overlooked. The light in Thierry's library was still on. He was waiting. And when I walked past the open door, I saw him sitting at his desk, not looking at financial reports, but staring intently at a small-framed, decades-old photograph of a man I didn't recognize. It was a tiny crack in his impenetrable armor, and I suddenly feared that he wasn't just investigating the Blackwoods, he was anticipating Dorian. The tiny framed photograph on Thierry's desk became a haunting obsession. It was the first time I had seen my meticulous, reserved husband display anything so purely personal and disconnected from finance. The next morning, fueled by coffee and a dangerous curiosity, I risked slipping back into the library while Thierry was at his morning meeting. The photo was yellowed with age, showing two young men, probably in their early 20s, posing beside an antique sports car. One was undeniably a younger, cockier Thierry, but the other, with a bright, almost reckless smile, was a stranger. I immediately felt a cold dread. This was Silas, Dorian's father. Thierry had kept a memento of the man he destroyed. It wasn't a triumphant display, it was tucked away, facing his chair like a private torment or a permanent reminder of a crucial mistake. The image shifted my perception entirely. Thierry and Silas hadn't just been business rivals, they had been friends. The betrayal wasn't merely professional, it was personal, deep, and intimate. This suggested a motive far more complex than simple corporate ambition, implying a level of pain in Thierry that I had never imagined, making him not just a villain, but another damaged protagonist in this unfolding drama. I tried a different approach with Thierry that night. attempting to coax the truth out of him without revealing my own catastrophic knowledge. I mentioned his early career, hinting at the high cost of success. He grew immediately rigid, his eyes becoming flat and remote, the familiar, impenetrable wall descending. "Business is business, Vivian," he said, cutting me off with a chilling finality. "There are always casualties. I learned early that sentimentality is a weakness that will destroy you." His voice was devoid of emotion, a direct confirmation of Dorian's accusations, but also a glimpse into a hardened soul I barely knew. My continued collaboration with Dorian intensified. Now that I knew the history, I sought the mechanics of the revenge. Dorian revealed that the Blackwoods weren't directly involved in the revenge plot. They were a legitimate holding company that Dorian was using as a shield. He was the one pulling all the strings, concealing his own money and identity behind their vast resources. The complexity of his plan was breathtaking, proving that he was not just an emotional son, but a brilliant, calculating operative, capable of manipulating systems far beyond my comprehension. I had partnered with a genius on a mission of vengeance. The danger escalated when I discovered a new detail about Thierry's behavior. I noticed that my car's GPS history, which I had recently checked after driving to Dorian's remote loft, had been cleared. Usually Thierry didn't touch the cars, leaving that to his assistant. It was a subtle, almost invisible intervention, but the implication was a jolt of pure terror. Thierry wasn't just investigating the Blackwoods, he was checking my movements. He wasn't just anticipating a corporate threat, he was anticipating a personal one. The walls were closing in fast. I realized Thierry might already have the suspicion or perhaps even the evidence that someone close to him was compromised. He was circling the truth like a predator, and I was the easy, vulnerable target. If he was looking for the corporate spy, he might find the unfaithful wife first. I had to know how much he knew and how close he was to finding proof. But the real fear wasn't his rage. It was the chilling thought that Thierry's silence might be a trap.
The realization that Thierry was meticulously monitoring my movements, albeit subtly, sent my paranoia soaring to a critical level. Every late meeting with Dorian, every furtive text message, now felt like a spotlight exposure. I stopped seeing Dorian in person for a week, opting instead for encrypted messaging. But the distance was torture. The fear of Thierry's cold detection was constantly warring with my desperate need for Dorian's intensity, which now represented the only space where I felt truly seen and alive. I was tethered between the safety I despised and the disaster I craved. The pressure mounted when Thierry, without preamble, announced he was taking an unexpected week-long business trip to Europe to finalize a highly sensitive acquisition. His timing was suspicious. It felt less like a work necessity and more like a strategic withdrawal designed to test my loyalty or to conduct covert business undisturbed. I forced a casual look of support, but inside, my mind was racing. This was my chance to search his office, to find the full file on Silas and the Blackwood deal, and finally understand the full scope of Dorian's revenge plan. The moment Thierry's car pulled away, I felt a chilling sense of freedom, immediately rushing to his library. This was no longer about passion. It was about self-preservation. I found the hidden safe behind a bookshelf, but the combination was too complex for a guess. Instead, I focused on his office laptop, where I knew he kept encrypted files. After several tense minutes of trial and error with dates and anniversaries, I unlocked a folder labeled Project Phoenix, which contained all the documents detailing the brutal collapse of Silas's company years ago. The files were devastating, confirming every dark detail Dorian had shared. As I sifted through the files, my hands trembling with shock and adrenaline, I came across a highly confidential legal document from the Blackwood firm. It wasn't about the takeover. It was a prenuptial agreement, an ironclad contract that Thierry had updated 2 years ago. The terms were draconian. In the event of adultery or professional compromise, I would leave the marriage with virtually nothing, stripped even of the house. The discovery wasn't just a legal warning,
It was a brutal confirmation that Thierry had anticipated my failure long before Dorian even stepped into the picture. I hurriedly copied the documents onto a small, unmarked USB drive, my insurance policy, and the proof Dorian needed to finalize his plan. In my panicked rush to erase my digital footprints, I knocked a small ornamental silver frame from the desk. It fell silently onto the thick Persian rug, but when I picked it up, I noticed a crucial detail. The small key attached to the back of the frame, the key to the impenetrable safe, had been meticulously wrapped in a tiny piece of clear plastic wrap, indicating it had been moved and replaced. A wave of absolute terror washed over me, freezing me in the act of betrayal. Thierry hadn't just gone on a business trip, he had staged a test. He knew I would look. He had likely replaced the key, or perhaps even installed a tiny sensor to see if it was disturbed. He wasn't a fool. He was a silent, lethal genius. I had walked right into his trap, leaving physical evidence, the disturbed plastic wrap on the hidden key, that I had been searching his private workspace. I had secured my proof, but in doing so, I had just signed my own confession. The thought of the disturbed plastic wrap on the hidden key paralyzed me. It was a microscopic detail, something only a man as meticulously calculating as Thierry would notice, but it confirmed the terrifying truth. I had walked right into his trap. The staged trip wasn't a business necessity. It was an elaborate setup to test my loyalty. My frantic heart hammered a single message: Thierry knows. The man who had been cold and distant was now revealed to be a silent, strategic predator, patiently waiting for his prey to expose itself. The prenuptial agreement restricting me in the event of my adultery or professional compromise suddenly felt like a prophecy. Clutching the USB drive, the evidence of Thierry's decades-old betrayal and my own recent one, I realized my only path to survival lay with Dorian. Thierry would never forgive me, and now that I had the Phoenix files, I was too dangerous to be kept close. I was no longer fighting for my marriage. I was fighting for my financial and emotional freedom. The memory of the chilling, absolute silence in Thierry's eyes after the revelation of the prenup convinced me that his vengeance would be far colder and more systematic than any rage. I needed a champion, and Dorian, the man sworn to his revenge, was my only desperate hope. I called Dorian immediately, speaking in quick, hushed tones, the sheer panic in my voice overriding all caution. I told him I had the file, the full, unadulterated history of Silas's destruction. He didn't ask questions. His voice was low, instantly switching into the controlled, commanding tone of an operative recognizing a critical success. He knew the significance of the Phoenix documents. They were the final piece of leverage he needed to bring Thierry's entire empire down. He told me to meet him at the loft immediately, and the urgency in his command felt like a powerful, necessary drug. Driving through Marindale to Dorian's hidden apartment felt like a dizzying cinematic flight from justice. The guilt of my actions was replaced by a furious survival instinct. I was trading Thierry's security for my own, and the shame of that choice was a constant, bitter taste. The moment Dorian opened the door, he didn't even attempt a greeting. His eyes were on the USD drive, clutched in my hand, burning with the intensity of years of delayed vengeance. He took the drive, his fingers brushing mine, and the brief, shared electric current was a final confirmation of our destructive partnership. As he plugged the drive into his secured laptop, I finally confessed my fatal error, the disturbed plastic wrap on the safe key. Dorian's face, usually so controlled, showed a flicker of grim realization. He looked at me, not with pity, but with a sudden, unkerning respect for the immense risk I'd just taken. "He knows, Vivian," he confirmed, his voice barely a whisper. "Thierry won't call, won't scream. He will just make the walls fall quietly. His analysis validated my deepest fears, confirming that my quiet, stable husband was the most dangerous adversary of all. I had done it. I had handed over the smoking gun, not just compromising Thierry's business, but actively participating in its intended destruction. I had committed the ultimate, final act of treason. Dorian, now looking directly at me, a victorious, chilling smile playing on his lips, confirmed the terrible price. The files are everything. The game is over, Vivian, and now we wait for Thierry's final move. But before he strikes, there's one more truth you need to know about the night Silas fell.
Dorian's confession that there was one more truth about the night Silas fell chilled me far more than the revelation of the prenuptial. I knew Thierry was ruthless in business, but Dorian's deep, quiet stare suggested a layer of malice I hadn't yet grasped. He began to speak, his voice grave, detailing the final moments of his father's professional life. It wasn't just a corporate battle. It was a carefully constructed assassination that went beyond mere profit. The Phoenix files only showed the financial moves, not the savage personal betrayal that allowed them to succeed. Dorian explained that Silas and Thierry hadn't just been childhood friends. They were partners in the early days of their careers, bound by a mutual trust that Thierry exploited with surgical precision. The final catastrophic move wasn't a hostile acquisition of a competitor. It was Thierry's deliberate manipulation of their shared internal financial documents, which forced Silas to take the fall for a massive, illegal debt. Silas believed he was protecting Thierry, his friend and partner, until the very end. The files I copied showed the debt, but masked Thierry's signature, framing Silas perfectly. Thierry didn't just ruin my father's business, Vivian, Dorian whispered, the intensity in his eyes blazing with years of simmering hatred. He sacrificed him to save himself from criminal charges. He didn't just steal the money. He stole my father's honor and his future. I felt a sudden, profound disgust for the man I had married. My husband was not just a cold capitalist. He was a moral void who used the loyalty of a friend as a shield. The shame of my own infidelity suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the depth of Thierry's calculated treachery. The tragedy of Silas's downfall was now clear, and Dorian's vendetta felt not just justified, but necessary. Yet, as Dorian spoke, a crucial detail snagged my attention, sparking a flicker of doubt about my supposed ally. He mentioned that Silas's failure stemmed from a bad investment made in a risky overseas market, a move Dorian described as desperate and careless. The way he emphasized the word careless felt too dismissive, too clinical for a devoted son mourning his father's integrity. The defense was too quick, too perfect. I pressed him on it, my voice hesitant. Was your father completely innocent, Dorian? Were there no mistakes on his side? He looked away briefly, a small but significant break in his intense gaze. My father was a dreamer, Dorian stated, carefully choosing his words. He was vulnerable. Thierry knew that vulnerability and used it against him. It was an answer, but a carefully curated one that didn't fully deny his father's role. I realized Dorian wasn't just hiding Thierry's full crime. He was curating his father's martyrdom. The true revelation wasn't just Thierry's guilt, but Dorian's own ambiguity. He was an avenger, yes, but he was also a man who manipulated the truth to serve his own narrative, much like Thierry. The fire I ran toward was not pure. It was complicated by its own layers of deceit. We were all broken, deeply flawed people, fighting a war where no one wore a white hat.
I was now allied with a man who was just as skilled at weaving deception as the man I was leaving. And that, the silence after handing over the Phoenix files was deceptive. It was the eerie stillness before a tsunami hits the shore. Dorian, armed with the undeniable evidence of Thierry's decades-old fraud, executed his plan with terrifying speed and precision. Within 48 hours, while Thierry was supposedly finalizing his acquisition in Europe, the financial markets were rocked by a massive, targeted scandal. The headlines, screaming across every major financial news source, didn't mention Dorian or the Blackwoods. They simply accused Thierry of systemic fraud stemming from an old, illegal liability that had just resurfaced. I watched the news reports from my living room, the beautiful, opulent space suddenly feeling like a collapsing temple. The details of the initial charges mirrored the information I had copied. The rigged documents, the massive debt, a devastating proof of the effectiveness of Dorian's vengeance. Thierry's empire, that fortress of security I had run from, was instantly exposed as a house of cards built on a terrible, long-ago lie. I felt a surge of cold, clinical satisfaction. Justice was being served, and Thierry was finally forced to pay for the betrayal he thought was buried forever. The social consequences were immediate and brutal. My phone became a cold, silent weight as friends and colleagues, sensing the stench of failure, instantly retreated. Thierry's assistant called, frantic and tearful, demanding to know where he was and relaying the fact that federal authorities were already preparing warrants. I maintained the perfect, shocked wife performance, claiming complete ignorance, but the act felt thin and shaky. My fear wasn't about being complicit in a crime. It was about being publicly associated with the massive, ugly failure that was now Thierry's exposed reputation. Dorian contacted me briefly, his tone a mix of exhilaration and finality. "The first wave is complete, Vivian. He'll be finished financially by the end of the week." His voice sounded like a man who had just won a grueling war, but there was no mention of us, no talk of a future together, only the successful execution of his mission. That omission struck me with a sudden, painful clarity. I had served my purpose. I was the means to the end, the perfect vector of betrayal, and now that the job was done, the fire he offered me seemed to be burning out just as quickly as Thierry's empire was collapsing. Alone in the house that night, surrounded by the remnants of Thierry's shattered world, I found myself strangely numb. I had been willing to embrace the disaster, but I hadn't anticipated this hollow, cold victory. It confirmed my darkest suspicion about Dorian, that the romance was a function of the vengeance, not an independent force. I had traded the safety of a cold life for the destruction of a passionate one. I was free, but freedom felt devastatingly lonely and cheap. The final, unexpected blow landed late that night. A car pulled quietly into the driveway, its headlights cutting through the darkness. It wasn't the police. It was Thierry, days before he was due home. His face was etched with a terrifying, absolute calm. He walked through the door and, ignoring the blazing news on the television, looked straight at me, his eyes colder than the sea. "You went into my study, didn't you, Vivian? You found the file, and you talked to Dorian." His tone wasn't accusatory. It was simply a statement of fact, confirming that the ultimate confrontation had arrived.
Thierry's composure amidst the unfolding financial ruin was terrifying. He sat there, impeccable in his travel clothes, the silence of the room heavier than any scream. "I know you went into the library. I know you found the Project Phoenix files," he repeated, his gaze flat and analytical, devoid of the rage I had braced for. "And I know you gave them to Dorian, the son of Silas, the man I ruined. The question is, did Dorian tell you what really happened to his father?" His question wasn't about the affair or the money. It was about the truth. And the precise, cold way he phrased it instantly turned the tables. My shock was absolute. I stammered, defending Dorian's narrative, reciting the story of Silas's betrayal and the criminal frame-up. Thierry simply listened, nodding slowly, a dark smile playing on his lips. Silas was my friend, Vivian. And yes, I ruined him, but not in the way Dorian told you. He finally stood, walking to the wall and pulling aside a section of the bookshelf, revealing a locked, hidden compartment. Not the safe I had searched, but a smaller one. From it he pulled a single, thick envelope marked with a private solicitor's seal and placed it on the table between us. Dorian is a smart boy, but he only knows half the story, the half that feeds his need for vengeance. Thierry opened the envelope, pulling out documents far older and more damning than anything in the Phoenix files. He explained that Silas, deeply in debt from the reckless overseas investment Dorian had dismissed as careless, had become involved with organized crime. When the debts came due, Silas was going to be physically harmed and his family was in danger. The debt was real, and it was fatal. Thierry confessed that he hadn't framed Silas. He had sacrificed his company, the only thing he could control, to the authorities, to make the financial ruin look like a massive corporate fraud. This act, while destroying Silas's reputation and company, had simultaneously wiped out the criminal debt, making Silas untouchable by the syndicate. I destroyed his life to save his actual life, Thierry concluded, his voice cracked with years of holding the secret. It was the only move I had left. I saved his life, Vivian, and he spent the next 20 years hating me for it. The horrifying truth hit me like a physical blow. Thierry hadn't been an evil schemer, he had been a tragic protector, forced to become the villain to save his best friend from a fate worse than bankruptcy. I realized that Dorian's passion, his fire, and his entire mission were built on a powerful, beautiful, and utterly devastating lie of omission. I hadn't partnered with an avenger. I had partnered with a useful idiot, a pawn, who was destroying the man who had saved his father. As I stared at the truth laid bare on the table, Thierry delivered the final crushing blow, looking directly into my soul. Dorian wasn't just using you for the files, Vivian. He told me everything. He came to me 2 weeks ago and said he'd stop the attack if I paid him a massive sum. Thierry didn't just know about the affair. He had been negotiating with my lover. He traded your loyalty and our destruction for a price. Your tragic hero, Vivian, is just a paid mercenary. The truth didn't just hurt. It was a psychological obliteration, erasing the narrative I had built my betrayal upon. The man I despised, Thierry, had been carrying a secret burden for 20 years, forced to live as a villain to save his friend's life. The man I risked everything for, Dorian, wasn't an avenging angel fueled by pure, tragic love. He was a vengeful opportunist whose tragic passion was just a negotiation tactic with the man he claimed to hate. I hadn't chosen fire. I had chosen a sophisticated, expensive lie. My tears weren't for Thierry's destruction, but for the devastating realization that I had been played for a fool, a weak link in a corporate negotiation. Thierry watched me, his expression finally shifting from cold calculation to a quiet, profound exhaustion. I knew you were lonely, Vivian. I knew you were searching for the fire I couldn't give you, he admitted, his voice barely audible. But you didn't have to burn down the house to find it. His words were a scalpel, cutting through my self-pity and exposing the core of my failure. I was guilty, not just of adultery, but of cowardice, fleeing a difficult conversation with my husband for the easy escape offered by a handsome stranger. Then he detailed the full extent of Dorian's mercenary play. Dorian had proposed a meeting weeks ago, using the Marindale project as leverage. He didn't initially ask for cash, but for an opportunity to be officially brought into Thierry's firm, a demand Thierry saw as a blatant betrayal of his father's legacy.
Only when Thierry refused to hand over part of his company did Dorian demand the cash to call off the attack. Thierry hadn't gone to Europe to finalize a deal. He had gone to secure the funds to pay Dorian's blackmail, buying time until the real financial attack was ready. The true moment of sickening clarity came when Thierry revealed that he had allowed Dorian to proceed with the attack anyway. I knew what you had done when I saw the plastic wrap disturbed Vivian. I knew Dorian had the files. I decided that the risk of letting Dorian ruin me was less painful than paying a mercenary who slept with my wife. I let him think he won just so I could be rid of both the Blackwood threat and the lie that was our marriage. I stood there, stripped of my secrets, my illusions, and my perfect tragic narrative. My great, passionate affair was a business deal, and my cold, distant husband was a man who sacrificed his entire empire to avoid rewarding my betrayal. The profound lesson wasn't about fidelity, it was about truth. If I had simply talked to Thierry about our silence, none of this would have happened. I had allowed my loneliness to be weaponized against myself, believing the spectacular lie over the quiet, difficult truth. Thierry no asked for a divorce. He simply stated the facts. The legal proceedings begin tomorrow, Vivian. You get the house and a generous settlement, the opposite of the prenup, because you didn't ruin me out of malice, but out of desperation. He left the room, leaving me utterly alone in the wreckage of his empire and my own moral collapse. I had escaped the prison of my marriage to find myself in a new, cold cage built entirely by my own actions. The choice was clear. I had to finally face the woman I had become without the distraction of either man.
Thierry's departure left behind a silence far more profound than the one I had tried to escape for 15 years. This time, the silence was not the apathy of a distant marriage, but the deafening clarity of my own self-betrayal. I wandered through the ruins of our beautiful home, touching the surfaces, the cold marble, the expensive artwork, and seeing not status, but the monumental cost of my dishonesty. I had despised Thierry for his coldness, yet I was the one who was truly cold, sacrificing loyalty and security for the fleeting warmth of a devastating lie. The beautiful fire I ran toward with Dorian had left me with nothing but ashes. I finally allowed myself to read the documents Thierry had left behind, the official account of Silas's salvation. The evidence was irrefutable. Thierry had indeed chosen to be hated rather than allow his friend to be killed by criminals. He had carried the massive weight of that secret, allowing even his own wife to believe he was a monster. I realized that love wasn't just about the loud, exciting expressions of passion. It was often about the quiet, terrifying choices made in the dark, the acts of sacrifice no one ever applauds. I had failed to see the subtle, complex love in Thierry's silence, chasing a superficial passion that was never truly meant for me. The betrayal by Dorian, that mercenary twist, was the final, necessary sting. He hadn't just used me to get the files, he had used the hollow space in my heart as his weapon. He knew I craved passion and purpose, and he provided the perfect, seductive narrative of an avenging hero, only to try and sell that narrative for profit. I had convinced myself that I was brave for seeking my own happiness, but the truth was I was simply lazy, choosing the easy seduction over the difficult, honest work of fixing my own marriage. Dorian's betrayal was the mirror that finally forced me to see my own moral bankruptcy. The irony was crushing. I had spent years feeling like a ghost in my own marriage, only to truly lose myself in the pursuit of another man. The consequence wasn't financial ruin. Thierry had given me the house and security. The true punishment was the unbearable knowledge that I was responsible for destroying the one thing I valued, my own sense of honor. I had traded a life built on solid, if cold ground, for an illusion, and the illusion had evaporated, leaving me with a deep personal debt to pay. There was no turning back, no hope of reconciliation with Thierry, and certainly no contact with Dorian, who had vanished as suddenly as he arrived.
I was truly, completely alone. And for the first time in my life, I had to face the difficult task of defining myself outside of any man's gaze. I had to build a new life, not on the foundation of a husband's security or a lover's intensity, but on the brittle, hard-earned ground of truth and self-awareness. I realized the ultimate lesson was this: temptation doesn't come disguised as a monster, it comes disguised as salvation. And the greatest betrayal isn't one committed against a spouse, but the one committed against your own integrity. I had spent years feeling like a ghost in my own marriage, only to truly lose myself in the pursuit of another man. It's been 2 years since the wreckage. Marindale still exists, the waves still crash against the shore, but the woman who once walked its beaches, Vivian, is gone. The divorce was finalized quietly as Thierry intended, leaving me with the financial security he deemed necessary, a final, silent act of complicated care. He kept the secret of Silas's salvation and Dorian's mercenary betrayal, ensuring that even in his absence, he protected my reputation from the ugly truth of my weakness. I never saw Dorian again. The fire had consumed itself entirely, leaving no trace behind except for the profound scars it left on my memory. I sold the big house. I couldn't bear to live in the monument to my delusion and Thierry's silence. The space felt too cold, too heavy with the weight of unsaid words and reckless actions. I moved into a smaller, simpler apartment by the quieter side of the city, finally embracing the solitude I once feared. The greatest challenge wasn't rebuilding my life. It was rebuilding my own self-respect. I had to learn to live with the knowledge that I was the villain in my own story, the one who chose the spectacular lie over the quiet, difficult truth of commitment. I finally understood the meaning of real love, distinct from the fleeting adrenaline of passion. Passion is a gift. It's easy and explosive, often disguising itself as fate. But love is a choice, a difficult, continuous decision to stay and work through the silence, to choose the cold reality of the roots over the destructive heat of the fire. I had been so convinced that Thierry's lack of visible passion meant a lack of love that I missed the profound protective love hidden in his choices, even his choice to sacrifice his own reputation to save a friend. My tragedy wasn't finding Dorian. My tragedy was losing the strength to speak my truth to Thierry before the temptation arrived. If I had simply confessed my loneliness, if I had initiated the tough, honest conversation about the fire dying out, we might have fought for our roots instead of watching them tear apart. I allowed fear and desperation to guide me. And fear is the most expensive architect of all. It builds prisons and calls them escapes. So I tell you the story not as a cautionary tale against love, but against deceit. The deceit we practice on our partners, and more dangerously, the deceit we practice on ourselves. We all have empty spaces in our lives, but we must be vigilant about who we allow to fill them. Are they offering a temporary flame or a genuine commitment to rebuilding? The answer determines whether you end up with a life of warmth or a pile of cold, regrettable ashes. I stand here now on my own, defined not by the man I chose or the man I left, but by the devastating lesson of honesty. If you are standing at the edge of the fire, chasing the thrill of the forbidden, ask yourself this one vital question. Is the passion you seek worth the integrity you will inevitably lose? Because the choices we make in our weakest, most desperate moments are the ones that define our ultimate legacy.